Good morning, class. Welcome to another day of Read Aloud. We're starting chapter 9 today, and so you'll remember chapter 8 was when Buck had joined the male chain, like the sled dogs, part of the male team, okay? And so they're doing kind of really hard work that's not as fun as racing on a quick pace. They're just going along slowly, but it's still good work. And unfortunately, at the end of the chapter, we notice that Dave is no longer part of the team, okay? So now let's see what happens next. This chapter is called The Tenderfeet. Okay? 30 days from the time they left Dawson, Buck and his team arrived at Skagway. They were worn out and worn down. Buck's 140 pounds had gone down to 115. The rest of his mates had lost weight too. Pike limped with a hurt leg. Sol-leks was also limping, and Dub was suffering from a hurt shoulder blade. The dogs were all very footsore. Their feet plodded along with no joy for the work. The months of constant toil left them with no strength. It had all been used. Every muscle, every fiber, every cell was tired, dead tired. And there was reason for it. In less than 5 months, they had traveled 2,500 miles with little or no rest. When they arrived at Skagway, they were on their last legs. "Mush on, poor sore feets," the driver said as they slowly staggered down the main street of Skagway. "This is the last. Then we get one long rest, eh? For sure. One long rest." The drivers expected a long stopover. They deserved a rest and a chance to relax, but there were so many men who had rushed to the Klondike in search of gold that the mail loads had increased. Fresh teams of dogs were brought in to take the places of the worn-out teams. These worthless dog teams were no longer useful in the mail runs, and so these teams were sold. After only 3 days of rest, Buck's team, harness and all, was bought by 2 men from the United States. The men called each other Hal and Charles. Charles was a man about age 40 with watery eyes and a mustache that twisted up. Hal was a young man of 19 or 20 with a big revolver and a hunting knife strapped to his belt. Both men were out of place. They were tenderfeet, newcomers who did not know the ways of the wild north. The new owner's camp was a mess. The tent was put up poorly and the dishes were not washed. There was also a woman with them called Mercedes. She was Charles's wife and Hal's sister. 3 tenderfeet in one family. Buck watched the 2 men take the camp apart and load the sled. They did not know how to roll the tent. The tin dishes were packed away unwashed. Mercedes kept complaining and giving advice to Hal and Charles. They packed and unpacked several times, never getting things just right for Mercedes. 3 men from a neighboring tent came out and looked on, grinning and winking at one another. "You've got a right big load as it is," said one of them. "It's not for me to say, but I wouldn't tote that tent along if I was you." "Nonsense!" cried Mercedes. "How ever in the world could I manage without a tent?" "It's springtime, ma'am. You won't get any more cold weather," the man replied. She shook her head at the men. "You think that sled will ride?" one of the men asked. "Why shouldn't it?" Charles demanded. "I was just wondering, that's all. Seems a mite top-heavy," said the man. Charles turned his back and tied the bundles down as best he could, which was rather sloppily. "And of course the dogs can hike all day with that top-heavy load, eh?" came another comment. "Certainly," said Hal. He took hold of the gee-pole with one hand and the whip with the other. "Mush!" he shouted. "Mush on there!" The dogs sprang forward, strained hard for a few moments, then relaxed. They were unable to move the sled. "The lazy brutes! I'll show them!" Hal cried, raising his whip, but Mercedes cried, "Oh, Hal, you mustn't!" She caught hold of the whip and pulled it from him. "The poor dears! Now you must promise you won't be harsh with them for the rest of the trip, or I won't go a step." "You know nothing about dogs," her brother sneered, "and I wish you'd leave me alone. They're lazy, I tell you, and you've got to whip them to get anything out of them. That's their way, you ask anyone. And ask any of those men." Mercedes looked at the men. "They're much too weak, if you want to know," replied one. "Plumb tuckered out, that's what's the matter. They need rest." "Rest indeed," snarled Hal. "Never mind that man," Mercedes said. "You're driving our dogs, and you do what you think is best with them." Again Hal's whip fell upon the dogs. They threw themselves forward, dug their feet into the packed snow, got down low to it, and pulled forth all their strength. The sled would not move. After 2 efforts, they stood still, panting. Hal's whip kept singing. Mercedes stopped the whipping, dropping on her knees before Buck, and with tears in her eyes, put her arms around his neck. "You poor, poor dears," she cried. "Why don't you pull hard? Then you wouldn't be whipped." Buck did not like her. An onlooker spoke up. I don't care a whoop what becomes of you, but for the dog's sake, I just want to tell you this. You can help them a mighty lot by breaking out that sled. The runners are frozen in the icy snow. Throw your weight against the gee pole right and left and break it out. After a third try, Hal broke out the runners, which had been frozen in the snow. The dogs managed to pull the overloaded sled down the path, but when the path turned onto the main street, the top-heavy sled went over, spilling half its load. The dogs never stopped. The sled bounded on its side behind them. Buck was raging at the whippings they had received. He broke into a run, and his team followed his lead. Whoa, whoa, Hal cried out. He tripped and was pulled off his feet. The dogs dashed up on the street as they scattered the remainder of the gear along the main street of Skagway. The dogs and the scattered gear and the clothes were rounded up. You need just half the load and twice the dogs if you ever expect to reach Dawson, the men told Charles, Hal, and Mercedes. Mercedes cried while she went through clothes, deciding what to keep. Although they went through every article until the load was cut in half, it was still too bulky. Charles and Hal went out that evening and bought 6 outsider dogs. This brought their team up to 14, but the newcomer dogs did not amount to much. They did not seem to know anything. Buck speedily taught them their places and what not to do, but he could not teach them what to do. They did not take kindly to Trace and Trail. The 2 men were quite proud and cheerful as they set off down the trail with 14 dogs. 14 dogs not ready for the hard work ahead. 8 dogs were dead tired, and 6 dogs had never pulled a sled. But 14 dogs they had. They had never seen a sled with so many as 14 dogs. In the Arctic, there was a reason why 14 dogs should not drag one sled. This was that one sled could not carry the food needed for 14 dogs. But Charles and Hal did not know this. They had worked up the trip with a pencil, so much to a dog and so many dogs in so many days. It was also very simple. Buck felt that he could not depend upon these 2 men and the woman. They did not know how to do anything and did not want to learn. They were lazy. It took them half the night to pitch camp and half the morning to break that camp and get the sled loaded. Yet the work was so sloppy that for the rest of the day they had to stop and rearrange the load. Some days they did not make 10 miles. Other days they were unable to get started at all. And all the while, the food supply was going down. And that is chapter 9.